Hi, this is Ruben Langdon, and this is another Conversation That Matters. Today we're here with Stephen Bassett, who's been in the UFO ET realm for many, many years. Why don't you introduce yourself and let everybody know what your history and what you've been doing?
Well, first of all, I am dedicated to eradicating UFO from the English language. That's all right. Now you're in concordance with most of the culture, but UFO is the anachronism that described the connection to this phenomenon going back to the 40s, unidentified flying objects. It also became the kind of centerpiece of the government's effort to embargo this by kind of ridiculing it and ghettoizing it and what have you. So as long as it stayed unidentified flying object, then nothing can really happen, can it? We were like physics, the physics of small particles saying that what do you do? Well, we study unidentified small particles, right? And even if we identify them, we still call them unidentified small particles. So, and the reason this is important is that my work is, I'm not a ufologist. I'm a political, actually an exopolitical activist. And my job is to advocate for the resolution of this issue. And the reason advocacy is needed is because this issue was politicized by the government, made a national security matter in that sense, for what they felt were legitimate reasons back in the late 40s, early 50s. And the policy was that the government would not acknowledge the reality of this phenomena, no matter what happened, no matter what kind of evidence turned up, until they felt it was safe. And the principal reason that they didn't feel it was safe was because, whether by coincidence or not, the explosion of the ET phenomena in the late 40s, really starting in early 1947, virtually coincided with the early days of what became the Cold War. And the circumstances were that by the time of the Roswell crash, which was an alien crash vehicle, and they did get dead bodies and one live body, our military intelligence community...
I'm just going to interrupt right there, just because most people, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with hearing the Roswell crash in various movies and media, but you're putting it out there as it is a fact.
Well, it's a fact for me.
Well, and I just wanted to just jump in and just say, you know, because I've done a bit of research into it as well, and there is quite a number of, or I'd say a bundle of evidence that shows it. And could you just kind of relate to some of the evidence, just because a lot of people haven't done the research?
Well, let's just say that, well, thanks to the internet, right, all of our viewers today can simply Google Roswell, and they can keep themselves busy for a couple of months. But if they want to just get right to the heart of the matter, they need to read a recent book called Witness to Roswell by Thomas Carey and Donald Schmidt, and that'll pretty much lock it down. Okay. Understand, this was an extremely important event, profound event. The government went to huge lengths to contain it. They did a pretty good job. And so the only reason it isn't an absolute fact in the mind of everyone is because the government did everything it could to prevent that. However, a huge amount of research has been done by a lot of people. Hundreds of witnesses have been interviewed one time or another. And it is a crashed extraterrestrial vehicle. So with that in mind, at the time that happens, again, our military and intelligence community were well aware that the Soviet Union was without question an enemy of the West and an enemy of the United States. In other words, you could blame them. You could blame a lot of people for this. There were a lot of reasons why that happened. It was a tragedy, to be sure. We were allies in destroying the Axis powers. But after the war, it went badly. And so they knew that they were an enemy. They also knew they had atomic fission bomb secrets and fusion bomb secrets. They were already working on them. And they eventually, of course, exploded. Tests on both of those. And they also were working on missiles because they got their own paperclip Nazi rocket scientists, too. We didn't get them all.
Right.
And so, frankly...
You're referring to Project Paperclip.
Project Paperclip, which was brought over the scientists.
It was after World War II, bringing over all the Nazi scientists and kind of integrating them into the U.S. Military and NASA and everything, right?
Yes, we brought everything back that we got our hands on, including rocket scientists and other tech scientists, as well as equipment, whatever. Fine, spoils of war. The Soviets did the same thing. But what's really important here is that it was clear, even by 1947, that we were very likely headed for a third war, which shouldn't shock anybody since we'd already had 2 world wars, why not a third, except that this one could very well be nuclear. This was unprecedented. Right. In all of in I guess 8,000 years of bad behavior going back to the Sumerians, all the wars, all the bloodshed, all the violence, we really topped ourselves here. And they realized, my God, the next one, well, as the famous quote, and I forget who made it, is that if we do have a World War III, the World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.
Right.
So this is what they were facing. And so they made the decision that until this sort of shook out, worked itself out, this issue needed to be contained as best as possible, given the fact that the ETs can come and go as they please. Right, it wasn't like it was some secret bomber program down underground that they just wouldn't tell anybody about. They were trying to convince the public in various ways that all that stuff they're seeing, it's not really a big deal, don't worry about it. Very complicated, they pulled it off. So that was essentially a national security decision,
sure,
which puts it in the realm of government, which puts it in the realm of politics, because I can assure you in the early days, not so much now, the ultimate decision to do that came right from the president. Right, because back then, the presidents really pretty much were true commanders-in-chief. Initially, it was Truman during the Roswell event, and then, of course, he's followed by Eisenhower, who was obviously a pretty substantial figure. That's really changed. That's another discussion. But so what happened is that the Cold War lasted, I think, a lot longer than they imagined. I don't think that those gentlemen back there who were trying to work out the post-World War II situation imagined for a minute that we would end up in a 44-year Cold War with this Soviet empire, that we would end up building at the peak between 70 and 80, have 70, 80,000 nuclear warheads between us and 3 or 4 other countries, that they would be on hair trigger alert, not only from ground bases in the respective countries, but also submarines offshore, and that we virtually would be seconds or even minutes away from complete annihilation. I don't think they could have imagined it. And so what happened is the Cold War just got worse and worse and worse if you count the number of weapons and the potential damage. And I'm certain that the policy became quite ingrained that as long as that Cold War was going on, there was no way the ET issue could be dropped into that. And the reason was, I'm sure, could be made very complicated, but let's make it simple.
Right.
It's a complicated world with all of the countless variables in play, and we know that wars can come from any direction, sometimes by the strangest of coincidences of events. And so if you suddenly impose on the world this new reality that extraterrestrials are here now engaging us, the unintended consequences of that could easily lead to a war in one way or another. It was just a little too much more than we could carry. Now, once the Cold War ends in 91, late 91, that principal barrier goes away, and then the decision to, quote, go forward and acknowledge the ET presence or not becomes even more political. More importantly, the relationship between the issue and the military intelligence complex and the president and the Congress became much more problematic, even dysfunctional, and so that's also a political issue. And that's why we now have a whole genre called exopolitics, which is designed to engage all of the social political aspects of this, past, present, and future. And it's a growing field, and I think one day it'll be a very, very significant field. And so I work in the genre of exopolitics. I'm an exopolitical activist. The principal advocacy underway now, and there are others, but the one that really matters, is bringing about the circumstance where the acknowledgement of the extraterrestrial presence by the world governments, probably starting with one government first, as opposed to a consortium, has taken place. We call that event, just the event, disclosure with a capital D. And so the goal of this movement, so the goal of, say, the women's suffrage movement was the right to vote, the amendment that gave them the right to vote. I think it was the 13th I'm not sure. And the goal of this advocacy movement is disclosure of that event. Until we get that, we have not achieved the fundamental goal. And that describes what I do.
And well, that describes what you do, but how do you go about doing that on a day-to-day basis?
Well, it's an advocacy movement. And so you do all those things that advocate. What's different about this, there's never been an advocacy movement quite like this one. It's unique, to say the least.
To say the least, I was just going to say.
And there are reasons for that. I mean, books could be written about that.
Right.
But most people know what advocacy movements are. They know that the women's rights movement is one, the suffrage movement for vote was one, independence movements in countries like India and others are advocacy movements. The anti-apartheid movement to end apartheid, and of course the anti-segregation movement in this country, the civil rights movement, these are all advocacy movements.
Absolutely.
They can be huge, they can be broad, and they're very important by and large. World-changing in a sense. And they generally are conducted along similar lines. Pamphlets and information, and forming groups and marching, petitioning the nation and so forth. Sometimes they get violent. One of the most important developments of the 20th century was almost the formalization of nonviolent advocacy, where it became the default position. And of course, we owe that to Gandhi and King, and the human race will never run out of the need to honor them for that, right? And this advocacy movement that I'm in is, of course, nonviolent. But what makes this unusual? One of the key things that make it unusual, several things. One, the subject matter is on its face outside the human condition.
It's a taboo subject matter.
Well, but before you even make it taboo, even before it's taboo, it's outside the human condition. So in other words, a woman trying to get the right to vote, this is pretty much right there in their face,
Absolutely.
okay? Yeah. Men vote, I don't, elections come along, they don't do it. So I want that, right? Or if you are a black in the South in the 40s or 30s and you can't do things and you have separate facilities, very, very basic, all right? The extraterrestrial issue is about the reality that we're not alone in the universe and that there are other civilizations out there and they're already engaging us, but not in the open.
Right.
And so for virtually anyone in terms of their day-to-day life, it doesn't have a direct connection, a reasonable direct connection to what they do. Now, getting people to jump into something like that when it's outside virtually their daily life is not easy. It's also a highly intellectual issue. I mean, you really have got to do some serious thinking if you want to grasp this. You have to expand your mind, you have to open it up a lot, and you have to bring in a whole lot of ideas. And then thirdly...
And it goes against not just basic values, but religions and all sorts of beliefs and ideas that I think, the human race itself has been, like you said, conditioned. We're conditioned not to believe in this this phenomenon.
Well,
it's changing. It's changing.
All major advocacies challenge or go after issues that challenge the status quo. So it kind of has that in common.
Yeah.
But the true difference between this and almost any advocacy movement in history is that the very point of the movement itself, the fundamental core, the state, the ruling authority, says doesn't exist.
Sure.
Now people say, well, why is that odd? What's unusual? And I can give you an easy analogy. It would be like Gandhi and his followers in the early days trying to galvanize the Indian people to seriously considering seeking independence and having the British leave, removing the British from India. At the same time that the Indian ruling authorities, in other words, the sub-government that, of course, that the British rule over, were constantly telling the people, there are no British here. No British here. But wait a minute, I thought I saw one the other day. Oh, that was somebody dressed up as a Brit. But I have a photograph. Oh, it's faked, right? Literally denying the fundamental issue at hand. That's extremely odd. Now, of course, in that case, it would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? However, in the case of the ET issue, you could do it, and the government did do it. And so you're going to the people, and you're saying, we need to have the government acknowledge extraterrestrial presence. And the government says, there is no presence to acknowledge. Case closed, thank you very much.
Right.
That makes the movement rather unusual, to say the least.
Difficult.
Yeah. All right. And so that is the number one. So now there have been somewhat similar. There have been a few things similar to that. The closest analogy to what we're going through, and it's not a clean analogy to be sure, but that people generally know about, is the efforts of the Catholic Church, which dominated Europe. Right. Now, this is primarily an analogy that is confined to Europe and South America to some degree. In late 1400s, 1500s, early 1600s, as more knowledge about the solar system emerged through the work of Copernicus and Kepler, and of course Galileo and others, a lot of others that are not known, but they were there. There's an intellectual community in Europe. To understand the nature of the solar system, this threatened Catholic doctrine, and so the Catholic Church decided, we're just not going to acknowledge that. Right? Now, back then, you could really get draconian about that. Sure. And so they were not hesitant to kill, burn, torture people who wanted to pursue that or state that, which obviously was a significant deterrence on people exploring that. In other words, what was the upside in becoming an astronomer in like 1610? Not good.
Right.
They literally said, no. All that stuff that you're hearing, it's not real. All right. The world up there is exactly as we tell you. Now, back then, given the nature of the times, they pulled it off for quite a while.
A few hundred years.
Right. And they actually didn't get around apologizing for that, I think, until like 2002 or something. I need to get that exact date. They finally apologized for it. It was a big mistake for them that they hope not to make again. Mm-hmm. That is about the closest analogy. Right. So if somebody says, well, I want to study astronomy because I've been learning about these things. Oh, those things aren't real. And it's coming from the Pope, who can excommunicate you. And so you go, okay, I won't study that. Same thing here. The government says nothing here, so why are you bothering with this? Why are you investing your time? And by the way, if you're a wealthy philanthropist or a granting institution, you don't want to fund that. There's nothing there. It's nothing.
Sure.
So this is what really, that's the closest analogy to what we're seeing.
Right.
But what the Catholic Church did in the 1600s doesn't even come close to what the government's pulled off, because they tried to do the same thing in a time when we have television and radio and news satellites and the internet eventually, newspapers. We have a literate public, highly educated. We have 5,000 universities and colleges, and we have a First Amendment right to free speech. And in that genre, that venue rather, milieu, the government was able to actually contain the issue by saying, oh, it doesn't exist. Unbelievable. But they were very serious about it. So that is what separates this advocacy. It makes it tough, but I'll tell you, if I had to choose between the difficulty of the advocacy I'm involved in, as opposed to what the anti-apartheid movement went through, or the civil rights movement went through, I'd take this one every time. I mean, it hasn't been that bad. It hasn't been that painful. And unfortunately, it's in the United States. Sure. Right. Now, those that would say wanted to pursue this issue in the Soviet Union.
I was just going to say, I was going to ask, how is the exopolitic movement in other countries? And, introduced some other guests or folks
sure.
in the same research and departments. How is it? How's it going?
Is this international?
Brazil,
yes.
Russia.
Well, this is the thing. Without any serious funding, in other words, working within the ghetto that the government created for this issue, where you're really cut off from the mainstream media, certainly less so now, and funding and granting money and so forth. We just seize the internet, and the internet, of course, is the most powerful networking and information tool of all time. So that is what has made this issue advocacy possible, given the constraints we're under. And of course, the internet just screams global, international, all right? So if PRG, my organization, Paradigm Research Group, is going to be given credit for anything, probably one of the most important things it's done is using the internet, created the Exopolitics World Network. Mm-hmm. It costs virtually nothing to do. And what it is to try to create a obvious, visible network around the world addressing the issue, giving people platforms to work from. And we've done a number of things. First, created the exopoliticsworld.net,
Right.
which is the hub, right? And what you find there is, and also exopoliticsunitedstates.net, which is kind of a sub to that. But at exopoliticsworld.net, what you find is a list of countries where there's a portal website. Exopolitics Spain, Exopolitics United Kingdom, Exopolitics Germany, right? You know, give it a consistency. And the URLs are very similar, exopoliticsgermany.de and so forth. And each one of these webmasters is more than that. They're an activist, and they're doing other things. They're creating conferences. Right. And so we've got about 28, 29, and we're adding more. Japan will come on soon.
Nice.
And so that creates this global network where people are able to communicate with each other and put information up. In addition, we have the Cities Initiative, where anyone that wants to just have a group, right, that meets, say, once a month, and call it an exopolitics group, then we'll list it in the Cities Initiative section. And we already have 20 or 30 up there, so exopolitics, in that listing, we exopolitics Los Angeles, exopolitics Paris, exopolitics London, what have you. And so we'll list as many as people want to do that. Then there's also a Facebook group called Exopolitics World Network, that is got about 2,600 members, but we're using the social networks to create this. The advocacy network, the issue network, and in the 21st century, the way you know you have a network is you Google, right? And so you Google exopolitics, which is nice because it really only has one use in the English language, and that is dealing with the ET issue. There is nothing else. I think there's a couple non-ET usages, but you almost never see them.
So that
and
subject.
up comes the list, right?
Okay.
And you see it. You see organizations, you see the Exopolitics Institute, you see the countries, you see the U.S. city listings, all of this stuff, and you begin, wow, there's a network developing. And so this is nascent, but nevertheless coming along nicely. One day I'd like to see about 75 countries with 75 websites, and maybe 25 of the 50 U.S. states, and that will be very useful. So that's one of the most important things I've done. Now, the other thing is that I have had the opportunity to tour Europe and Australia, and I've been to about, 20 countries, given about 40 lectures. And yes, the interest overseas is very high.
I was going to ask, how have you seen this movement, so to say, grow through the years, through your involvement in it?
Well, it's grown without question because of the internet, because of all the documentaries pouring out, right? And the cable channels and their willingness to run these documentaries in the early days on TLC, A&E, Discovery. Now History is running them constantly. These have just raised the public awareness. And of course, I'm not the only advocate. I mean, there are other advocates. There's no question we're making progress. There's no question that the things are changing on this. So we have a legitimate international movement, and it is going somewhere. And where it's going is that at one point, a nation, probably the U.S., but there's another dozen or so that I consider likely candidates to make the first move, is going to announce the ET presence. They'll provide some nice evidence just to make sure you get the point, and it'll be pretty clear. And almost immediately, other nations will follow suit.
Sure.
And I think it's very important. It's going to be very important which nation goes forward. There's going to be implications to that. The United States has a great deal to lose by continuing to remain to be intransigent on this. But that's the U.S. government's decision. My focus is on the U.S. government, though, even though I've built this network.
Sure.
Because obviously I'm in a position to be more aggressive there. I don't want to be going to other countries and telling other nations how to do it.
Right. They have their own rules.
Yeah.
You know the rules here. This is your ballpark, so to say.
Yes, exactly. So And part of this advocacy is new language. If you look at almost every advocacy movement in history, they create new language so that people have the right terminologies to address the issue at hand. Because you're usually breaking new territory. New territory means new language. And so the term exopolitics, the term disclosure, right? This is part of the new language. that we're trying to emphasize. And then also getting away from UFO, which is an anachronism. Not that there aren't unidentified flying objects, all right? But
they're more than that. They're extraterrestrial.
They're obviously more than that. If a pilot looks out the cockpit and sees a 30-foot silver disc flying along with the plane, okay, yeah, it's still, in a sense, unidentified, but it's not completely unidentified.
Yeah, by this day and age, we're pretty sure that a flying saucer, you know, is somewhat related to an extraterrestrial. However, you know, there's always the government and their secret programs, and we didn't, you know, the stealth bomber and all these other things. Who's to say that they're not flying around in?
We think they are.
In flying saucer type vehicles.
In the present era, and going back maybe 20, 30 years, as much as 30 years, it's very possible that if a pilot looked out the cockpit and saw a saucer off their window, that it could be a human, probably U.S. saucer. However, these sightings go back before then.
Yes, no, absolutely.
And while those that simply can't accept this or say, oh no, we had these saucers back in 1940s, I'm sorry. Now, understand, that's just not, it's not just that there's a saucer out there flying around the airplane. We also have a huge amount of evidence regarding ETs themselves on the ground. So you put those two together, that's not very unidentified. The idea that, oh, until the saucer opens up a little cockpit and an ET sticks its head up and says, we're from Zeta Reticuli, that you have an identified object is nonsense, all right? But nonsense is at the core of the truth embargo. It is very odd, it is contradictory, it's convoluted, it's paradoxical, it's designed to keep people just running around in circles and while the government is able to maintain their position, which is, we don't want to tell you this yet. However, the majority of people in this country now believe they do need to tell us,
right.
And that a vast majority, 80+%, know that they're lying. And when you look at how trust in government is collapsing and the dysfunction in government, one can make a very good case that maintaining this lie is no longer serves the national interest.
I just saw a poll yesterday, actually. I think it was on Japanese TV. They did a special where they were asking about how many of the population believed in extraterrestrials. I think actually extraterrestrial spacecraft parked outside of planet Earth.
Right.
And I think Brazil was number one with almost 50% of the population, and Japan was number two with 48%. And America was a little bit down the list, but still America was in the top, 5 or 6. I think.
A few years ago, a huge poll was done by the global polling operation called Ipsos, IPSOS, in conjunction, I think, with Reuters, if I'm not mistaken. They polled the world on a very relatively severe question: do you think extraterrestrials are among us? Right?
Okay.
Now, that's a tough question.
Yeah.
And the result was 25% of the world believes that. In other words, they polled India. They polled about 26 nations, huge number of people. They chose nations to try to be representative of all nations. About 25%. The highest number was 45% in India. Wow. Now, this is ETs amongst us, all right? I believe that if they
That's
had
more
asked,
than just asking if, does life exist outside the planet?
which is the easiest question.
Yeah.
Are there life somewhere in the universe? I think the number's up there now in the 80s, high 80s.
Sure.
The real question, though, is this phenomenon we've been seeing, some of it extraterrestrial in origin. And if you look at the polls that have been done in certain countries, and then you look at the Ipsos poll, it's very easy to conclude that had they asked that question worldwide, the answer would have been 50%. And so essentially, 3.5 billion people on this planet believe, personally, anonymously, without having to let it be known to their family and friends, that this phenomenon is extraterrestrial. And yet the governments are still acknowledging, no, we can't talk about it, or it's not real. This is a disconnect that is not healthy.
So with that said, do you see, I have a hard time at doing my research and everything. I don't know if the government's actually going to come out and say, just do disclosure. Do you think it would be with other movements in the past, do you think it would actually be the people pushing the movement, forcing the government to play their hand and come out and say that they would do it? Or do you think they're going to just do it? Or, what's going to come first? It's like the chicken or the egg.
Well, look, we are putting pressure on the government. And so when the government does it, one can make a case that we pressured them into it. That's not the dichotomy that's important. The dichotomy is whether governments on their own, pressured by whatever means, whether it's other countries competing with each other or citizens within the country, come forward and acknowledge this ET presence. Or the ETs do something so overt that it literally breaks the issue open. Okay, right. And of course the classic representation of this is the moment in Independence Day when the president walks out on the portico of the White House and says, "Well, I guess the answer to the question, are we alone, is now here." Right. We don't want that. These are the dichotomy, and I can assure you that the latter will be far more disruptive and damaging to the social contracts and the well-being of people on this planet than the former, which is the acknowledgement by the countries to their citizens without that kind of force majeure event. Sure. Now, some people can argue that, but I can market that case pretty well. You don't want that. And then one of the great exopolitical questions that could be asked, and the answer is not known, but it's certainly worth discussion. I'd love to have this discussion on some nice college campuses, is there kind of a time frame? In other words, is there a limit to the extraterrestrial patience? Right. Is there at some point, because I believe there is an agenda here, I believe this is all pretty much organized, this is not random, that is there a matter of time at some point at which the ETs are going, look, we've given you plenty of time here, that's it. Okay, so you're about to get
so then they just show up, or they just leave
They do
forever?
whatever is necessary. Well, they could leave, right? That's true. So really the question has two parts. Is there a time frame in which we don't disclose, they go, okay, we'll come back, see you in about 500 years, right, or they force the action? I doubt they're going to leave. I really doubt that. But force the action, very possible. So that's a very significant exopolitical question, which would make for a great discussion in the mainstream reality, except, of course, within the mainstream ghetto, that we're outside the ghetto we're in the mainstream, there's nothing to debate or discuss here because there are no extraterrestrials. Well, not the case. So the sooner we get past this, I think the better for the American people. And of course, it opens up a whole new world. And opening up whole new worlds is what the human race has been doing forever. I mean, that's what we do.
Exactly.
All right. And whenever we start denying the reality that we're in, and we've done this before, it just stops us. It just stops us. And usually bad things happen. And then we finally accept reality, because reality is really where you want to be if you're going to have a serious life, okay? And what a good example of that is, you can jump off a building and feel like I'm going to fly, and it'll be okay because I'm not, my reality is I can fly.
Right.
But unfortunately for you, that's not reality, and you will pay a consequence. And so whenever the human race, either individually, collectively, decides to separate from reality to carry their affairs out, bad things happen.
Well, let's hope bad things don't happen. We're about out of time right now. So everybody, Stephen Bassett, and these are the conversations that matter.